Chapter 5 of the Prairie by James Fenimore Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Peck. Why, worthy father, what have we to lose? The law protects us not, then why should we be tender, to let an arrogant piece of flesh threat us? Play judge and executioner. Cymbeline. While the Teton thus enacted his subtle and characteristic part, not a sound broke the stillness of the surrounding prairie. The whole band lay at their several posts, waiting, with the well-known patience of the natives, for the signal which was to summon them to action. To the eyes of the anxious spectators who occupied the little eminence already described as the position of the captives, the scene presented the broad, solemn view of a waste dimly lighted by the glimmering rays of a clouded moon. The place of the encampment was marked by a gloom deeper than that which faintly shadowed out the courses of the bottoms, and here and there a brighter streak tinged the rolling summits of the ridges. As for the rest, it was the deep, imposing quiet of a desert. But to those who so well knew how much was brooding beneath this mantle of stillness at night, it was a scene of high and wild excitement. Their anxiety gradually increased, as minute after minute passed away, and not the smallest sound of life arose out of the calm and darkness which enveloped the brake. The breathing of Paul grew louder and deeper, and more than once Ellen trembled at she knew not what, as she felt the quivering of his active frame, while she leaned dependently on his arm for support. The shallow honesty, as well as the besetting infirmity of Weucha, have already been exhibited. The reader, therefore, will not be surprised to learn that he was the first to forget the regulations he had himself imposed. It was at the precise moment when we left Mahtoree yielding to his nearly ungovernable delight, as he surveyed the number and quality of Ishmael's beasts of burden, that the man he had selected to watch his captives chose to indulge in the malignant pleasure of tormenting those it was his duty to protect. Bending his head nigh the ear of the trapper, the savage rather muttered than whispered. "If the Tetons lose their great chief by the hands of the Long knives," (Footnote: the whites are so called by the Indians, from their swords), "old shall die as well as young." "Life is the gift of the Wahcondah," was the unmoved reply. "The burnt wood warrior must submit to his laws, as well as his other children. Men only die when he chooses, and no Dahcotah can change the hour." "Look," returned the savage, thrusting the blade of his knife before the face of his captive. "Weucha is the Wahcondah of a dog." The old man raised his eyes to the fierce visage of his keeper, and, for a moment, a gleam of honest and powerful disgust shot from their deep cells, but it instantly passed away, leaving in its place an expression of commiseration, if not of sorrow. "Why should one made in the real image of God suffer his nature to be provoked by a mere effigy of reason?" he said in English, and in tones much louder than those in which Weucha had chosen to pitch the conversation. The latter profited by the unintentional offence of his captive, and, seizing him by the thin, grey locks that fell from beneath his cap, was on the point of passing the blade of his knife in malignant triumph around their roots, when a long, shrill yell rent the air, and was instantly echoed from the surrounding waste, as if 1,000 demons opened their throats in common at the summons. Weucha relinquished his grasp, and uttered a cry of exultation. "Now," shouted Paul, unable to control his impatience any longer, "now, old Ishmael, is the time to show the native blood of Kentucky. Fire low, boys! Level into the swales, for the redskins are settling to the very earth." His voice was, however, lost, or rather unheeded, in the midst of the shrieks, shouts, and yells that were by this time bursting from 50 mouths on every side of him. The guards still maintained their posts at the side of the captives, but it was with that sort of difficulty with which steeds are restrained at the starting post, when expecting the signal to commence the trial of speed. They tossed their arms wildly in the air, leaping up and down more like exulting children than sober men, and continued to utter the most frantic cries. In the midst of this tumultuous disorder a rushing sound was heard, similar to that which might be expected to precede the passage of a flight of buffaloes, and then came the flocks and the cattle of Ishmael in one confused and frightened drove. "They have robbed the squatter of his beast," said the attentive trapper. "The reptiles have left him as hoofless as a beaver." He was yet speaking, when the whole body of the terrified animals rose the little acclivity, and swept by the place where he stood, followed by a band of dusky and demon-like looking figures, who pressed madly on their rear. The impulse was communicated to the Teton horses, long accustomed to sympathize in the untutored passions of their owners, and it was with difficulty that the keepers were enabled to restrain their impatience. At this moment, when all eyes were directed to the passing whirlwind of men and beasts, the trapper caught the knife from the hands of his inattentive keeper, with a power that his age would seem to contradict, and at the single blow severed the thong of hide which connected the whole of the drove. The wild animals snorted with joy and terror, and tearing the earth with their heels, they dashed away into the broad prairies in a dozen different directions. Weucha turned upon his assailant with the ferocity and agility of a tiger. He felt for the weapon of which he had been so suddenly deprived, fumbled with impotent haste for the handle of his tomahawk, and at the same moment glanced his eyes after the flying cattle, with the longings of a western Indian. The struggle between thirst for vengeance and cupidity was severe but short. The latter quickly predominated in the bosom of one whose passions were proverbially grovelling, and scarcely a moment intervened between the flight of the animals and the swift pursuit of the guards. The trapper had continued calmly facing his foe, during the instant of suspense that succeeded his hardy act, and now that Weucha was seen following his companions, he pointed after the dark train, saying, with his deep and nearly inaudible laugh, "Red natur' is red natur'. Let it show itself on a prairie or in the forest. A knock on the head would be the smallest reward to him who takes such liberty with a Christian sentinel. But there goes the Teton after his horses as if he thought 2 legs as good as 4 in such a race, and yet the imps will have every hoof of them afore the day sets in, because it's reason agin instinct. Poor reason, I allow, but still there is a great deal of the man in an Indian. Ah's me! Your Delawares were the redskins of which America might boast, but few and scattered is that mighty people now. Well, the traveller may just make his pitch where he is. He has plenty of water, though. Natur' has cheated him of the pleasure of stripping the 'arth of its lawful trees. He has seen the last of his 4-footed creatures, or I am but little skilled in Sioux cunning." "Had we not better join the party of Ishmael?" said the bee hunter. "There will be a regular fight about this matter, or the old fellow has suddenly grown chicken-hearted." "No, no, no!" hastily exclaimed Ellen. She was stopped by the trapper, who laid his hand gently on her mouth, as he answered, "Hist, hist! The sound of voices might bring us into danger. Is your friend," he added, turning to Paul, "a man of spirit enough?" "Don't call the squatter a friend of mine," interrupted the youth. "I never yet harboured with one who could not show hand and zeal for the land which fed him." "Well, well, let it then be acquaintance. Is he a man to maintain his own stoutly by dint of powder and lead?" "His own? Ay, and that which is not his own, too. Can you tell me, old trapper, who held the rifle that did the deed for the sheriff's deputy, that thought to rout the unlawful settlers who had gathered nigh the Buffalo Lick in old Kentucky? I had lined a beautiful swarm that very day into the hollow of a dead beech, and there lay the people's officer at its roots, with a hole directly through the grace of God, which he carried in his jacket pocket covering his heart, as if he thought a bit of sheepskin was a breastplate against a squatter's bullet. Now, Ellen, you needn't be troubled, for it never strictly was brought home to him, and there were 50 others who had pitched in that neighbourhood with just the same authority from the law." The poor girl shuddered, struggling powerfully to suppress the sigh which arose in spite of her efforts, as if from the very bottom of her heart. Thoroughly satisfied that he understood the character of the emigrants, by the short but comprehensive description conveyed in Paul's reply, the old man raised no further question concerning the readiness of Ishmael to revenge his wrongs, but rather followed the train of thought which was suggested to his experience by the occasion. "Each one knows the ties which bind him to his fellow creatures best," he answered, "though it is greatly to be mourned that colour and property and tongue and l'arning should make so wide a difference in those who, after all, are but the children of one Father. Howsomever," he continued, by a transition not a little characteristic of the pursuits and feelings of the man, "as this is a business in which there is much more likelihood of a fight than need for a sermon, it is best to be prepared for what may follow. Hush! There is a movement below. It is an equal chance that we are seen."
"The family is stirring!" cried Ellen, with a tremor that announced nearly as much terror at the approach of her friends, as she had before manifested at the presence of her enemies. "Go, Paul, leave me. You at least must not be seen."
"If I leave you, Ellen, in this desert before I see you safe in the care of old Ishmael, at least may I never hear the hum of another bee, or, what is worse, fail in sight to line him to his hive."
"You forget this good old man. He will not leave me, though I am sure, Paul, we have parted before, where there has been more of a desert than this."
"Never! These Indians may come whooping back, and then where are you? Halfway to the Rocky Mountains before a man can fairly strike the line of your flight. What think you, old trapper? How long may it be before these Tetons, as you call them, will be coming for the rest of old Ishmael's goods and chattels?" "No fear of them," returned the old man, laughing in his own peculiar and silent manner. "I warrant me the devils will be scampering after their beasts these 6 hours yet. Listen! You may hear them in the willow bottoms at this very moment. Ay, your real Sioux cattle will run like so many long-legged elks. Hist! Crouch again into the grass. Down with ye both. As I am a miserable piece of clay, I heard the ticking of a gunlock." The trapper did not allow his companions time to hesitate, but dragging them both after him, he nearly buried his own person in the fog of the prairie, while he was speaking. It was fortunate that the senses of the aged hunter remained so acute, and that he had lost none of his readiness of action. The three were scarcely bowed to the ground, when their ears were saluted with the well-known sharp, short reports of the western rifle, and instantly the whizzing of the ragged lead was heard, buzzing within dangerous proximity of their heads. "Well done, young chips! Well done, old block!" whispered Paul, whose spirits no danger nor situation could entirely depress. "As pretty a volley as one would wish to bear on the wrong end of a rifle. What do you say, trapper? Here is likely to be a three-cornered war. Shall I give 'em as good as they send?" "Give them nothing but fair words," returned the other hastily, "or you are both lost." "I'm certain it would be much mend the matter if I were to speak with my tongue instead of the piece," said Paul, in a tone half jocular, half bitter. "For the sake of Heaven, do not let them hear you!" cried Ellen. "Go, Paul, go! You can easily quit us now." Several shots in quick succession, each sending its dangerous messenger still nearer than the preceding discharge, cut short her speech, no less in prudence than in terror. "This must end," said the trapper, rising with the dignity of one bent on the importance of his object. "I know not what need ye may have, children, to fear those you should both love and honour, but something must be done to save your lives. A few hours more or less can never be missed from the time of one who has numbered so many days. Therefore I will advance. Here is a clear space around you. Profit by it as you need, and may God bless and prosper each of you as ye deserve." Without waiting for any reply, the trapper walked boldly down the declivity in his front, taking the direction of the encampment, neither quickening his pace in trepidation, nor suffering it to be retarded by fear. The light of the moon fell brighter for a moment on his tall, gaunt form, and served to warn the emigrants of his approach. Indifferent, however, to this unfavourable circumstance, he held his way, silently and steadily, towards the copse, until a threatening voice met him with a challenge of, "Who comes, friend or foe?" "Friend," was the reply, "one who has lived too long to disturb the close of life with quarrels." "But not so long as to forget the tricks of his youth," said Ishmael, rearing his huge frame from beneath the slight covering of a low bush, and meeting the trapper face to face. "Old man, you have brought this tribe of red devils upon us, and to-morrow you will be sharing the booty." "What have you lost?" calmly demanded the trapper. "8 as good mares as travelled in gears. Besides, a foal is worth 30 of the brightest Mexicans that bear the face of the King of Spain. Then the woman has not a cloven hoof for her dairy, or her loom, and I believe even the grunters, footsore as they may be, are ploughing the prairie. And now, stranger," he added, dropping the butt of his rifle on the hard earth with a violence and clatter that would have intimidated one less firm than the man he addressed, "how many of these creatures may fall to your lot?" "Horses that I never craved nor even used, though few have journeyed over more of the wide lands of America than myself, old and feeble as I am. But little use is there for a horse among the hills and woods of York. That is, as York was, but as I greatly fear York is no longer. As for woolen covering and cow's milk, I covet no such womanly fashions. The beasts of the field give me food and raiment. No, I crave no cloth better than the skin of a deer, nor any meat richer than his flesh." The sincere manner of the trapper, as he uttered this simple vindication, was not entirely thrown away on the emigrant, whose dull nature was gradually quickening into a flame, that might speedily have burst forth with dangerous violence. He listened like one who doubted, not entirely convinced, and he muttered between his teeth the denunciation with which a moment before he intended to precede the summary vengeance he had certainly meditated. "That is brave talking," he at last grumbled, "but to my judgment too lawyer-like, for a straightforward fair-weather and foul-weather hunter." "I claim to be no better than a trapper," the other meekly answered. "Hunter or trapper, there is little difference. I have come, old man, into these districts because I found the law sitting too tight upon me, and am not over fond of neighbours who can't settle a dispute without troubling a justice and 12 men. But I didn't come to be robbed of my plunder, and then to say thank ye to the man who did it." "He who ventures far into the prairies must abide by the ways of its owners." "Owners!" echoed the squatter. "I am as rightful an owner of the land I stand on as any governor in the States. Can you tell me, stranger, where the law or the reason is to be found, which says that one man shall have a section, or a town, or perhaps a county to his use, and another have to beg for earth to make his grave in? This is not nature, and I deny that it is law, that is, your legal law." "I cannot say that you are wrong," returned the trapper, whose opinions on this important topic, though drawn from very different premises, were in singular accordance with those of his companion, "and I have often thought and said as much, when and where I have believed my voice could be heard. But your beasts are stolen by them who claim to be masters of all they find in the deserts." "They had better not dispute the matter with a man who knows better," said the other in a pretentious voice, though it seemed deep and sluggish as he who spoke. "I call myself a fair trader, and one who gives his chaps as good as he receives. You saw the Indians?" "I did. They held me a prisoner, while they stole into your camp." "It would have been more like a white man and a Christian to have let me known as much in better season," retorted Ishmael, casting another ominous sidelong glance at the trapper, as if still meditating evil. "I am not much given to call every man I fall in with, cousin, but colour should be something when Christians meet in such a place as this. But what is done, and cannot be mended by words. Come out of your ambush, boys. Here is no one but the old man. He has eaten of my bread, and should be our friend, though there is such good reason to suspect him of harbouring with our enemies." The trapper made no reply to the harsh suspicion, which the other did not scruple to utter without the smallest delicacy, notwithstanding the explanations and denials to which he had just listened. The summons of the unnurtured squatter brought an immediate accession to their party. 4 or 5 of his sons made their appearance from beneath as many covers, where they had been posted under the impression that the figures they had seen, on the swell of the prairie, were a part of the Sioux band. As each man approached and dropped his rifle into the hollow of his arm, he cast an indolent but inquiring glance at the stranger, though neither of them expressed the least curiosity to know whence he had come or why he was there. This forbearance, however, proceeded only in part from the sluggishness of their common temper, for long and frequent experience in scenes of a similar character had taught them the virtue of discretion. The trapper endured their sullen scrutiny with the steadiness of one as practised as themselves, and with the entire composure of innocence. Content with the momentary examination he had made, the eldest of the group, who was in truth the delinquent sentinel by whose remissness the wily Mahtoree had so well profited, turned towards his father, and said bluntly— "If this man is all that is left of the party I saw in the upland yonder, we haven't altogether thrown away our ammunition." "Asa, you are right," said the father, turning suddenly on the trapper, a lost idea being recalled by the hint of his son. "How is it, stranger? There were 3 of you, just now, or there is no virtue in moonlight." "If you had seen the Tetons racing across the prairies like so many black-looking evil ones, on the heels of your cattle, my friend, it would have been an easy matter to have fancied them 1,000. "Ay, for a town-bred boy or a skeary woman, though for that matter there is old Esther. She has no more fear of a redskin than of a suckling cub, or of a wolf pup, I warranty. Had your thievish devils made their push by the light of the sun, the good woman would have been smartly at work among them, and the Siouxes would have found she was not given to part with her cheese and her butter without a price. But there will come a time, stranger, right soon, when justice will have its dues, and that too without the help of what is called the law. We are of a slow breed, it may be said, and it is often said of us, but slow is sure, and there are few men living, who can say they ever struck a blow, that they did not get one as hard in return, from Ishmael Bush." "Then has Ishmael Bush followed the instinct of the beast, rather than the principle which ought to belong to his kind?" returned the stubborn trapper. "I have struck many a blow myself, but never have I felt the same ease of mind that of the right belongs to a man who follows his reason, after slaying even a fawn when there was no call for his meat or hide, as I have felt at leaving a Mingo unburied in the woods, when following the trade of open and honest warfare." "What! have you been a soldier, have you, trapper? I made a forage or two among the Cherokees when I was a lad myself, and I followed Mad Anthony." Anthony Wayne, of Pennsylvania, distinguished in the war of the Revolution, and subsequently against the Indians of the West, for his daring as a general, by which he gained from his followers the title of Mad Anthony. General Wayne was the son of the person mentioned in the Life of West as commanding the regiment which excited his military ardour. "One season through the beaches, but there was altogether too much tattooing and regulating among his troops for me, so I left him without calling on the paymaster to settle my arrearages, though, as Esther afterwards boasted, she had made such use of the pay ticket, that the States gained no great sum by the oversight. You have heard of such a man as Mad Anthony, if you tarried long among the soldiers." "I fought my last battle, as I hope, under his orders," returned the trapper, a gleam of sunshine shooting from his dim eyes, as if the event was recollected with pleasure, and then a sudden shade of sorrow succeeding, as though he felt a secret admonition against dwelling on the violent scenes in which he had so often been an actor. "I was pressing from the States on the seashore into these far regions, when I crossed the trail of his army, and I fell in on his rear just as a looker-on, but when they got to blows, the crack of my rifle was heard among the rest, though, to my shame it may be said, I never knew the right of the quarrel as well as a man of 70 should know the reason of his acts afore he takes mortal life, which is a gift he never can return." "Come, stranger," said the emigrant, his rugged nature a good deal softened when he found that they had fought on the same side in the wild warfare of the West, "it is of small account what may be the groundwork of the disturbance, when it's a Christian ag'in a savage. We shall hear more of this horse-stealing to-morrow. To-night we can do no wiser or safer thing than to sleep." So saying, Ishmael deliberately led the way back towards his rifled encampment, and ushered the man, whose life a few minutes before had been in real jeopardy from his resentment, into the presence of his family. Here, with a very few words of explanation, mingled with scarce but ominous denunciations against the plunderers, he made his wife acquainted with the state of things on the prairie, and announced his own determination to compensate himself for his broken rest, by devoting the remainder of the night to sleep. The trapper gave his ready assent to the measure, and adjusted his gaunt form on the pile of brush that was offered him, with as much composure as a sovereign could resign himself to sleep, in the security of his capital and surrounded by his armed protectors. The old man did not close his eyes, however, until he had assured himself that Ellen Wade was among the females of the family, and that her relation, or lover, whichever he might be, had observed the caution of keeping himself out of view. After which he slept, though with the peculiar watchfulness of one long accustomed to vigilance, even in the hours of deepest night. End of chapter 5. By James Fenimore Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Peck. He is too picked, too spruce, too affected, too odd, as it were too peregrinate, as I may call it. Shakespeare. The Anglo-American is apt to boast, and not without reason, that his nation may claim a descent more truly honourable than that of any other people whose history is to be credited. Whatever might have been the weaknesses of the original colonists, their virtues have rarely been disputed. If they were superstitious, they were sincerely pious, and, consequently, honest. The descendants of these simple and single-minded provincials have been content to reject the ordinary and artificial means by which honours have been perpetuated in families, and have substituted a standard which brings the individual himself to the ordeal of the public estimation, paying as little deference as may be to those who have gone before him. This forbearance, self-denial, or common sense, or by whatever term it may be thought proper to distinguish the measure, has subjected the nation to the imputation of having an ignoble origin. Were it worth the inquiry, it would be found that more than a just proportion of the renowned names of the mother country are, at this hour, to be found in her sedevant colonies, and it is the fact well known to the few who have wasted sufficient time to become the masters of so unimportant a subject, that the direct descendants of many a failing line, which the policy of England has seen fit to sustain by collateral supporters, are now discharging the simple duties of citizens in the bosom of this republic. The hive has remained stationary, and they who flutter around the venerable straw are wont to claim the empty distinction of antiquity, regardless alike of the frailty of their tenement and the enjoyments of the numerous and vigorous swarms that are culling the fresher sweets of a virgin world. But as this is a subject which belongs rather to the politician and historian than to the humble narrator of the home-bred incidents we are about to reveal, we must confine our reflections to such matters as have an immediate relation to the subject of the tale. Although the citizen of the United States may claim so just an ancestry, he is far from being exempt from the penalties of his fallen race. Like causes are well known to produce like effects. That tribute, which it would seem nations must ever pay, by way of a weary probation, around the shrine of Ceres, before they can be indulged in her fullest favours, is in some measure exacted in America, from the descendant instead of the ancestor. The march of civilization with us has a strong analogy to that of all coming events, which are known to cast their shadows before. The gradations of society, from that state which is called refined to that which approaches as near barbarity as connection with an intelligent people will readily allow, are to be traced from the bosom of the states, where wealth, luxury, and the arts are beginning to seat themselves, to those distant and ever receding borders which mark the skirts, and announce the approach of the nation, as moving mists precede the signs of day. Here, and here only, is to be found that widely spread, though far from numerous class, which may be at all likened to those who have paved the way for the intellectual progress of nations in the Old World. The resemblance between the American borderer and his European prototype is singular, though not always uniform. Both might be called without restraint, the one being above, the other beyond the reach of the law. Brave, because they were inured to dangers; proud, because they were independent; and vindictive, because each was the avenger of his own wrongs. It would be unjust to the borderer to pursue the peril much farther. He is irreligious, because he has inherited the knowledge that religion does not exist in forms, and his reason rejects mockery. He is not a knight, because he has not the power to bestow distinctions, and he has not the power, because he is the offspring and not the parent of a system. In what manner these several qualities are exhibited, in some of the most strongly marked of the latter class, will be seen in the course of the ensuing narrative. Ishmael Bush has passed the whole of a life of more than 50 years on the skirts of society. He boasted that he never dwelt where he might not safely fell every tree he could view from his own threshold, that the law had rarely been known to enter his clearing, and that his ears had never willingly admitted the sound of a church bell. His exertions seldom exceeded his wants, which were peculiar to his class, and rarely failed of being supplied. He had no respect for any learning except that of the leech, because he was ignorant of the application of any other intelligence than such as met the senses. His deference to this particular branch of science had induced him to listen to the application of a medical man, whose thirst for natural history had led him to the desire of profiting by the migratory propensities of the squatter. The gentleman he had cordially received into his family, or rather under his protection, and they had journeyed together thus far through the prairies in perfect harmony. Ishmael often felicitating his wife on the possession of a companion, who would be so serviceable in their new abode, wherever it might chance to be, until the family were thoroughly acclimated. The pursuits of the naturalist frequently led him, however, for days at a time, from the direct line of the route of the squatter, who rarely seemed to have any other guide than the sun. Most men would have deemed themselves fortunate to have been absent on the perilous occasion of the Sioux inroad, as was Obed Bat, or, as he was fond of hearing himself called, Battius, M.D., and fellow of several cis-Atlantic learned societies, the adventurous gentleman in question. Although the sluggish nature of Ishmael was not actually awakened, it was sorely pricked by the liberties which had just been taken with his property. He slept, however, for it was the hour he had allotted to that refreshment, and because he knew how impotent any exertions to recover his effects must prove in the darkness of midnight. He also knew the danger of his present situation too well to hazard what was left in pursuit of that which was lost. Much as the inhabitants of the prairies were known to love horses, their attachment to many other articles, still in the possession of the travellers, was equally well understood. It was a common artifice to scatter the herds, and to profit by the confusion; but Mahtoree had, as it would seem in this particular, undervalued the acuteness of the man he had assailed. The phlegm with which the squatter learned his loss has already been seen, and it now remains to exhibit the results of his more mature determinations. Though the encampment contained many an eye that was long unclosed, and many an ear that listened greedily to catch the faintest evidence of any new alarm, it lay in deep quiet during the remainder of the night. Silence and fatigue finally performed their accustomed offices, and before the morning all but the sentinels were again buried in sleep. How well those indolent watchers discharged their duties, after the assault, has never been known, inasmuch as nothing occurred to confirm or to disprove their subsequent vigilance. Just as day, however, began to dawn, and a grey light was falling from the heavens on the dusky objects of the plain, the half-startled, anxious, and yet blooming countenance of Ellen Wade was reared above the confused mass of children, among whom she had clustered on her stolen return to the camp. Arising warily, she stepped lightly across the recumbent bodies, and proceeded with the same caution to the utmost limits of the defences of Ishmael. Here she listened, as if she doubted the propriety of venturing further. The pause was only momentary, however, and long before the drowsy eyes of the sentinel, who overlooked the spot where she stood, had time to catch a glimpse of her active form, it had glided along the bottom, and stood on the summit of the nearest eminence. Ellen now listened intently, anxious to catch some other sound than the breathing of the morning air, which faintly rustled the herbage at her feet. She was about to turn in disappointment from the inquiry, when the tread of human feet making their way through the matted grass met her ear. Springing eagerly forward, she soon beheld the outlines of a figure advancing up the eminence on the side opposite to the camp. She had already uttered the name of Paul, and was beginning to speak in the hurried and eager voice with which female affection is apt to greet a friend, when, drawing back, the disappointed girl closed her salutation by coldly adding, "I did not expect, Doctor, to meet you at this unusual hour." "All hours and all seasons are alike, my good Ellen, to the genuine lover of nature," returned a small, slightly made, but exceedingly active man, dressed in an odd mixture of cloth and skins, a little past the middle age, and who advanced directly to her side with the familiarity of an old acquaintance. "And he who does not know how to find things to admire by this grey light, is ignorant of a large portion of the blessings he enjoys." "Very true," said Ellen, suddenly recollecting the necessity of accounting for her own appearance abroad that unreasonable hour. "I know many who think the earth has a pleasanter look at night than when seen by the brightest sunshine." "Ah! their organs of sight must be too convex. But the man who wishes to study the active habits of the feline race, or the variety, albinos, must indeed be stirring at this hour. I dare say there are men who prefer even looking at objects by twilight, for the simple reason that they see better at that time of day." "And this is the cause why you are so much abroad in the night?" "I am abroad at night, my good girl, because the earth is in its diurnal revolutions, leaves the light of the sun but half the time on any given meridian, and because what I have to do cannot be performed in 12 or 15 consecutive hours. Now have I been off 2 days from the family, in search of a plant that is known to exist on the tributaries of La Platte, without seeing even a blade of grass that is not already enumerated and classed." "You have been unfortunate, Doctor, but—" "Unfortunate!" echoed the little man, sidling nigher to his companion, and producing his tablets with an air in which exultation struggled, strangely, with an affection of self-abasement. "No, no, Ellen, I am any thing but unfortunate, unless indeed a man may be so called, whose fortune is made, whose fame may be said to be established for ever, whose name will go down to posterity with that of Buffon. Buffon! A mere compiler, one who flourishes on the foundation of the other men's labours. No, parsi passu with Solander, who bought his knowledge with pain and privations." "Have you discovered a mine, Dr. Bat?" "More than a mine, a treasure coin, a fit for instant use, girl. Listen! I was making the angle necessary to intersect the line of your uncle's march, after my fruitless search, when I heard sounds like the explosion produced by firearms." "Yes!" exclaimed Ellen eagerly, "we had an alarm." "And thought I was lost," continued the man of science, too much bent on his own ideas to understand her interruption. "Little danger of that. I made my own base, knew the length of the perpendicular by calculation, and to draw the hypotenuse had nothing to do but to work my angle. I suppose the guns were fired for my benefit, and changed my course for the sounds. Not that I think the sense more accurate, or even as accurate as a mathematical calculation, but I feared that some of the children might need my services." "They are all happily—" "Listen," interrupted the other, already forgetting his affected anxiety for his patients, in the greater importance of the present subject. "I had crossed a large tract of prairie, for sound is conveyed far when there is little obstruction, when I heard the trampling of feet, as if bisons were beating the earth. Then I caught a distant view of a herd of quadrupeds, rushing up and down the swells, animals which would have still remained unknown and undescribed, had it not been for a most felicitous accident. One, and he a noble specimen of the whole, was running a little apart from the rest. The herd made an inclination in my direction, in which the solitary animal coincided, and this brought him within 50 yards of the spot where I stood. I profited by the opportunity, and by the aid of steel and paper, I wrote his description on the spot. I would have given $1,000, Ellen, for a single shot from the rifle of one of the boys." "You carry a pistol, Doctor; why didn't you use it?" said the half inattentive girl, anxiously examining the prairie, but still lingering where she stood, quite willing to be detained. "Ay, but it carries nothing but the most minute particles of lead, adapted to the destruction of the larger insects and reptiles. No, I did better than to attempt waging a war in which I could not be the victor. I recorded the event, noting each particular with the precision necessary to science. You shall hear, Ellen, for you are a good and improving girl, and by retaining what you learn in this way, may yet be of great service to learning, should any accident occur to me. Indeed, my worthy Ellen, mine is a pursuit, which has its dangers as well as that of the warrior. This very night," he continued, glancing his eye behind him, "this awful night, has the principle of life, itself, been in great danger of extinction." "By what?" "By the monster I have discovered. It approached me often, and ever as I receded it continued to advance. I believed nothing but the little lamp I carried was my protector. I kept it between us whilst I wrote, making it serve the double purpose of luminary and shield. But you shall hear the character of the beast, and you may then judge of the risk we promoters of science run in behalf of mankind." The naturalist raised his tablets to the heavens, and disposed himself to read as well as he could by the dim light they yet shed upon the plain, premising with saying— "Listen, girl, and you shall hear, with what a treasure it has been my happy lot to enrich the pages of natural history." "Is it then a creature of your forming?" said Ellen, turning away from her fruitless examination, with a sudden lighting of her sprightly blue eyes, that showed she knew how to play with the foible of her learned companion. "Is the power to give life to an inanimate matter the gift of man? I would it were. You should speedily see a Historia Naturalis Americana that would put the sneering imitators of the Frenchman de Buffon to shame. A great improvement might be made in the formation of all quadrupeds, especially those in which velocity is a virtue. 2 of the inferior limbs should be on the principle of the lever, wheels, perhaps, as they are now formed, though I have not yet determined whether the improvement might be better applied to the anterior or posterior members, inasmuch as I am yet to learn whether dragging or shoving requires the greatest muscular exertion. A natural exudation of the animal might assist in overcoming the friction, and a powerful momentum he obtain, but all this is hopeless, at least for the present," he added, raising his tablets again to the light, and reading aloud.
October 6, 1805. That's merely the date, which I dare say you know better than I, mem. Quadruped, seen by starlight, and by the aid of a pocket lamp, in the prairies of North America. See journal for latitude and meridian. Genus, unknown, therefore named after the discoverer, and from the happy coincidence of being seen in the evening. Vespertilio horribilis americanus. Dimensions, by estimation, greatest length, 11 feet, height, 6 feet, head erect, nostrils expansive, eyes expressive and fierce, teeth serrated and abundant, tail horizontal, waving and slightly feline, feet large and hairy, talons long, curvated, dangerous, ears inconspicuous, horns elongated, diverging, and formidable, colour plumbeous ashy, with fiery spots, voice sonorous, martial, and appalling, habits gregarious, carnivorous, fierce, and fearless. "There!" exclaimed Obed, when he had ended this sententious but comprehensive description. "There is an animal, which will be likely to dispute with the lion his title to be called the king of the beast." "I know not the meaning of all that you have said, Dr. Battius," returned the quick-witted girl, who understood the weakness of the philosopher, and often indulged him with the title he loved so well to hear. "But I shall think it dangerous to venture far from the camp, if such monsters are prowling over the prairies." "You may well call it prowling," returned the naturalist, nestling still closer to her side, and dropping his voice to such low and undignified tones of confidence as conveyed a meaning still more pointed than he had intended. "I have never before experienced such a trial of the nervous system. There was a moment, I acknowledge, when the fortiter in me faltered before so terrible an enemy, but the love of natural science bore me up, and brought me off in triumph." "You speak a language so different from that we use in Tennessee," said Ellen, struggling to conceal her laughter, "that I hardly know whether I understand your meaning. If I am right, you wish to say you were chicken-hearted?" "An absurd simile drawn from an ignorance of the formation of the biped. The heart of a chicken has a just proportion to its other organs, and a domestic fowl is, in a state of nature, a gallant bird. Ellen," he added, with a countenance so solemn as to produce an impression on the attentive girl, "I was pursued, hunted, and in danger that I scorn to dwell on. What's that?" Ellen started, for the earnestness and simple sincerity of her companion's manner had produced a certain degree of credulity, even on her buoyant mind. Looking in the direction indicated by the doctor, she beheld in fact a beast coursing over the prairie, and making a straight and rapid approach to the very spot they occupied. The day was not yet sufficiently advanced to enable her to distinguish its form and character, though enough was discernible to induce her to imagine it a fierce and savage animal. "It comes! It comes!" exclaimed the doctor, fumbling, by a sort of instinct, for his tablets, while he fairly tottered on his feet under the powerful efforts he made to maintain his ground. "Now, Ellen, has fortune given me an opportunity to correct the errors made by starlight? Hold, ashy plumbeous, no ears, horns excessive." His voice and hand were both arrested by a roar, or rather a shriek, from the beast that was sufficiently terrific to appall even a stouter heart than that of the naturalist. The cries of the animal passed over the prairie in strange cadences, and then succeeded a deep and solemn silence, that was only broken by an uncontrolled fit of merriment from the more musical voice of Ellen Wade. In the meantime the naturalist stood like a statue of amazement, permitting a well-grown ass, against whose approach he no longer offered his boasted shield of light, to smell about his person without a comment or hindrance. "It is your own ass!" cried Ellen, the instant she found breath for words. "Your own patient, hard-working hack!" The doctor rolled his eyes from the beast to the speaker, and from the speaker to the beast, but gave no audible expression of his wonder. "Do you refuse to know an animal that has laboured so long in your service?" continued the laughing girl. "A beast that I had heard you say 1,000 times has served you well, and whom you love like a brother?" "Asinus domesticus," ejaculated the doctor, drawing his breath like one who had been near suffocation. "There is no doubt of genus, and I will always maintain that the animal is not of the species equus. This is undeniably Asinus himself, Ellen Wade. But this is not the Vespertilio horribilis of the prairies. Very different animals, I can assure you, young woman, and that differently characterized in every important particular. that carnivorous," he continued, glancing his eye at the open page of his tablets, "this granivorous habits, fierce, dangerous, habits, patient, abstemious, ears inconspicuous, ears elongated, horns diverging, and so on, horns none." He was interrupted by another burst of merriment from Ellen, which served in some measure to recall him to his recollection. "The image of the Vespertilio was on the retina," the astounded enquirer into the secrets of nature observed, in a manner that seemed a little apologetic, "and I was silly enough to mistake my own faithful beast for the monster, though even now I greatly marvel to see this animal running at large." Ellen then proceeded to explain the history of the attack and its results. She described, with an accuracy that might have raised suspicion of her own movements in the mind of one less simple than her auditor, the manner in which the beasts burst out of the encampment, and the headlong speed with which they had dispersed themselves over the open plain. Although she forbore to say as much in terms, she so managed as to present before the eyes of her listener the strong probability of his having mistaken the frightened drove for savage beasts, and then terminated her account by a lamentation for their loss, and some very natural remarks on the helpless condition in which it had left the family. The naturalist listened in silent wonder, neither interrupting her narrative, nor suffering a single exclamation of surprise to escape him. The keen-eyed girl, however, saw that as she proceeded, the important leaf was torn from the tablets, in a manner which showed that their owner had gotten rid of his delusion at the same instant. From that moment the world had heard no more of the Vespertilio horribilis americanus, and the natural sciences have irretrievably lost an important link in that great animated chain, which is said to connect earth and heaven, and in which man is thought to be so familiarly complicated with the monkey. When Dr. Bat was put in full possession of all circumstances of the inroad, his concern immediately took a different direction. He had left sundry folios, and certain boxes well stored with botanical specimens and defunct animals, under the good keeping of Ishmael, and it immediately struck his acute mind that marauders as subtle as the Sioux would never neglect the opportunity to despoil him of these treasures. Nothing that Ellen could say to the contrary served to appease his apprehensions, and consequently they separated, he to relieve his doubts and fears together, and she to glide as swiftly and silently as she had just before passed it, into the still and solitary tent. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of the Prairie by James Fenimore Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Peck. What? 50 of my followers at a clap? Lear. The day had now fairly opened on the seemingly interminable waste of the prairie. The entrance of Obed at such a moment into the camp, accompanied as it was by vociferous lamentations over his anticipated loss, did not fail to rouse the drowsy family of the squatter. Ishmael and his sons, together with the forbidding-looking brother of his wife, were all speedily afoot, and then, as the sun began to shed his light on the place, they became gradually apprised of the extent of their loss. Ishmael looked around upon the motionless and heavily loaded vehicles with his teeth firmly compressed, cast a glance at the amazed and helpless group of children, which clustered around their sullen but desponding mother, and walked out upon the open land, as if he found the air of the encampment too confined. He was followed by several of the men, who were attentive observers, watching the dark expression of his eye as the index of their own future movements. The whole proceeded in profound and moody silence to the summit of the nearest swell, whence they could command an almost boundless view of the naked plains. Here nothing was visible but a solitary buffaloe, that gleaned a meagre subsistence from the decaying herbage at no great distance, and the ass of the physician, who profited by his freedom to enjoy a meal richer than common. "Yonder is one of the creatures left by the villains to mock us," said Ishmael, glancing his eye towards the latter, "and that the meanest of the stock. This is a hard country to make a crop in, boys, and yet food must be found to fill many hungry mouths." "The rifle is better than the hoe, in such a place as this," returned the eldest of his sons, kicking the hard and thirsty soil on which he stood, with an air of contempt. "It is good for such as they who make their dinner better on beggars' beans than on hominy. A crow would shed tears if obliged by its errand to fly across the district." "What you say, trapper?" returned the father, showing the slight impression his powerful heel had made on the compact earth, and laughing with frightful ferocity. "Is this the quality of land a man would choose, who never troubles the county clerk with title deeds?" "There is richer soil in the bottoms," returned the old man calmly, "and you have passed millions of acres to get to this dreary spot, where he who loves to till the 'arth might have received bushels in return for pints, and that too at the cost of no very grievous labour. If you have come in search of land, you have journeyed hundreds of miles too far, or as many leagues too little." "There is then a better choice towards the other ocean?" demanded the squatter, pointing in the direction of the Pacific. "There is, and I have seen it all," was the answer of the other, who dropped his rifle to the earth, and stood leaning on its barrel, like one who recalled the scenes he had witnessed with melancholy pleasure. "I have seen the waters of the two seas. On one of them was I born, and raised to be a lad like yonder tumbling boy. America has grown, my men, since the days of my youth, to be a country larger than I once had thought the world itself to be. Near 70 years I dwelt in York province and state together. You've been in York, 'tis like?" "Not I, not I. I never visited the towns, but often have heard the place you speak of named. 'Tis a wide clearing there, I reckon." "Too wide, too wide. They scourge the very 'arth with their axes. Such hills and hunting grounds as I have seen stripped of gifts of the Lord, without remorse or shame. I tarried till the mouths of my hounds were defeated by the blows of the chopper, and then I came west in search of quiet. It was a grievous journey that I made, a grievous toil to pass through falling timber, and to breathe the thick air of smoky clearings, week after week as I did. 'Tis a far country, too, that state of York from this." "It lies ag'in the outer edge of old Kentuck, I reckon, though what the distance may be I never knew." "A gull would have to fan 1,000 miles of air to find the eastern sea, and yet it is no mighty reach to hunt across when shade and game are plenty. The time has been when I followed the deer in the mountains of the Delaware and Hudson, and took the beaver on the streams of the upper lakes in the same season. But my eye was quick and certain at that day, and my limbs were like the legs of a moose. The dam of Hector," dropping his look kindly to the aged hound, and crouched at his feet, "was then a pup, and apt to open on the game the moment she struck the scent. She gave me a deal of trouble, that slut, she did." "Your hound is old, stranger, and the rap on the head would prove a mercy to the beast." "The dog is like his master," returned the trapper, without appearing to heed the brutal advice the other gave, "and will number his days when his work amongst the game is over, and not before. To my eye things seem ordered to meet each other in this creation. 'Tis not the swiftest running deer that always throws off the hounds, nor the biggest arm that holds the truest rifle. Look round you, men. What will the Yankee choppers say, when they have cut their path from the eastern to the western waters, and find that a hand, which can lay the 'arth bare at a blow, has been there and swept the country, in very mockery of their wickedness? They will turn on their tracks like a fox that doubles, and then the rank smell of their own footsteps will show them the madness of their waste. Howsomever, these are thoughts that are more likely to rise in him who has seen the folly of 80 seasons, than to teach wisdom to men still bent on the pleasures of their kind. You have need yet of a stirring time, if you think to escape the craft and hatred of the Burnt Wood Indians. They claim to be the lawful owners of this country, and seldom leave a white more than a skin he boasts of, when once they get the power, as they always have the will, to do him harm." "Old man," said Ishmael sternly, "to which people do you belong? You have the colour and speech of a Christian, while it seems that your heart is with the redskins." "To me there is little difference in nations. The people I love most are scattered as the sands of the dry river beds fly before the fall hurricanes. Then life is too short to make use and custom with strangers, as one can do with such as he has dwelt amongst for years. Still I am a man without the cross of Indian blood, and what is due from a warrior to his nation is owing by me to the people of the States. Though little need have they, with their militia and their armed boats,
of help from a single arm of fourscore. Since you own your kin, I may ask a simple question. Where are the Sioux who have stolen my cattle? Where is the herd of buffaloes, which was chased by the panther across the plain, no later than the morning of yesterday? It is as hard—" "Friend," said Dr. Battius, who had hitherto been an attentive listener, but who now felt a sudden impulse to mingle in the discourse, "I am grieved when I find a venator or hunter of your experience and observation following the current of vulgar error. The animal you describe is in truth a species of the bos fidus, or bois sylvestris, as he has been happily called by the poets; but though of close affinity, it is altogether distinct from the common bubulus. Bison is the better word, and I would suggest the necessity of adopting it in the future, when you shall have occasion to allude to the species." "Bison or buffalo, it makes but little matter. The creature is the same, call it by what name you will, and—" "Pardon me, venerable venator, as classification is the very soul of the natural sciences, the animal or vegetable must of necessity be characterized by the peculiarities of its species, which is always indicated by the name—" "Friend," said the trapper, a little positively, "would the tail of a beaver make the worse dinner for calling it a mink? Or could you eat of the wolf, with relish, because some bookish man had given it the name of venison?" As these questions were put with no little earnestness and some spirit, there was every probability that a hot discussion would have succeeded between two men, of whom one was so purely practical and the other so much given to theory, had not Ishmael seen fit to terminate the dispute, by bringing into view a subject that was much more important to his own immediate interest. "Beavers, tails, and minks! Flesh may do to talk about before a maple fire and a quiet hearth," interrupted the squatter, without the smallest deference to the interested feelings of the disputants. "But something more than farm words, or words of any sort, is now needed. Tell me, trapper, where are your Siouxes skulking?" "It would be as easy to tell you the colours of the hawk that is floating beneath yonder white cloud. When a red-skin strikes his blow, he is not apt to wait until he is paid for the evil deed in lead." "Will the beggarly savages believe they have enough, when they find themselves master of all the stock?" "Nature is much the same, let it be covered by what skin it may. Do you ever find your longings after riches less when you have made a good crop, than before you were master of a kernel of corn? If you do, you differ from what the experience of a long life tells me is the common cravings of man." "Speak plainly, old stranger," said the squatter, striking the butt of his rifle heavily on the earth, his dull capacity finding no pleasure in a discourse that was conducted in so obscure allusions. "I have asked a simple question, and one I know well that you can answer." "You are right, you are right. I can answer, for I have too often seen the disposition of my kind to mistake it, when evil is stirring. When the Sioux have gathered in the beast, and have made sure that you are not upon their heels, they will be back nibbling like hungry wolves to take the bait they have left, or it may be, they'll show the temper of the great bears that are found at the falls of the Long River, and strike at once with the paw, without stopping to nose their prey." "You have then seen the animals you mention?" exclaimed Dr. Battius, who had now been thrown out of the conversation quite as long as his impatience could well brook, and who approached the subject with his tablets ready open, as a book of reference. "Can you tell me if what you encountered was of the species Ursus horribilis, with the ears rounded, front arcuated, eyes, destitute of the remarkable supplemental lid, with 6 incisors, 1 false, and 4 perfect molars?" "Trapper, go on, for we are engaged in reasonable discourse," interrupted Ishmael. "You believe we shall see more of the robbers?" "Nay, nay, I do not call them robbers, for it is the usage of their people, and what may be called the prairie law." "I have come 500 miles to find a place where no man can ding the words of the law in my ears," said Ishmael fiercely, "and I am not in a humour to stand quietly at a bar, while a red-skin sits in judgment. I tell you, trapper, if another Sioux is seen prowling around my camp, whatever it may be, he shall feel the contents of old Kentuck," slapping his rifle, in a manner that would be easily misconstrued, "though he wore the medal of Washington himself." The American government creates chiefs among the western tribes, and decorates them with silver medals hearing the impression of the different presidents. That of Washington is the most prized. "I call the man a robber who takes that which is not his own." "The Teton, and the Pawnee, and the Konza, and men of a dozen other tribes, claim to own these naked fields." "Nature gives them the lie in their teeth. The air, the water, and the ground are free gifts to man, and no one has the power to portion them out in parcels. Man must drink, and breathe, and walk, and therefore each has a right to his share of 'arth. Why do not the surveyors of the state set their compasses, and run their lines over our heads as well as beneath our feet? Why do they not cover their shining sheepskins with big words, giving to the landholder, or perhaps he should be called airholder, so many rods of heaven, with the use of such a star for a boundary mark, and such a cloud to turn a mill?" As the squatter uttered his wild conceit, he laughed from the very bottom of his chest in scorn. The deriding but frightful merriment passed from the mouth of one of his ponderous sons to that of the other, until it had made the circuit of the whole family. "Come, trapper," continued Ishmael, in a tone of better humour, like a man who feels that he has triumphed. "Neither of us, I reckon, has ever had much to do with title deeds, or county clerks, or blazed trees. Therefore we will not waste words on fooleries. You are a man that has tarried long in this clearing, and now I ask your opinion, face to face, without fear or favour. If you had the lead in my business, what would you do?" The old man hesitated, and seemed to give the required advice with deep reluctance. As every eye, however, was fastened on him, and whichever way he turned his face, he encountered a look riveted on the lineaments of his own working countenance. He answered in a low, melancholy tone— "I have seen too much mortal blood poured out in empty quarrels, to wish ever to hear an angry rifle again. 10 weary years have I sojourned alone on these naked plains, waiting for my hour, and not a blow have I struck again an enemy more humanized than the grizzly bear." "Ursus horribilis," muttered the doctor. The speaker paused at the sound of the other's voice, but perceiving it was no more than a sort of mental ejaculation, he continued in the same strain. "More humanized than the grizzly here, or the panther of the Rocky Mountains, unless the beaver, which is a wise and knowing animal, may be so reckoned. What would I advise? Even the female buffalo will fight for her young." "It never then shall be said, that Ishmael Bush has less kindness for his children than the bear for her cubs." "And yet this is but a naked spot for a dozen men to make head in, ag'in 500. "Ay, it is so," returned the squatter, glancing his eye towards his humble camp; "but something might be done with the wagons and the cottonwood." The trapper shook his head incredulously, and pointed across the rolling plain in the direction of the west, as he answered— "A rifle would send a bullet from these hills into your very sleeping cabins. Nay, arrows from the thicket in your rear would keep you all burrowed, like so many prairie dogs. It wouldn't do, it wouldn't do. 3 long miles from this spot is a place where, as I have often thought in passing across the desert, a stand might be made for days and weeks together, if there were hearts and hands ready to engage in the bloody work." Another low, deriding laugh passed among the young men, announcing, in a manner sufficiently intelligible, their readiness to undertake a task even more arduous. The squatter himself eagerly seized the hint, which had been so reluctantly extorted from the trapper, who by some singular process of reasoning had evidently persuaded himself that it was his duty to be strictly neutral. A few direct and pertinent inquiries served to obtain the little additional information that was necessary, in order to make the contemplated movement, and then Ishmael, who was, on emergencies, as terrifically energetic as he was sluggish in common, set about effecting his object without delay. Notwithstanding the industry and zeal of all engaged, the task was one of great labour and difficulty. The loaded vehicles were to be drawn by hand across a wide distance of plain, without track or guide of any sort, except that which the trapper furnished by communicating his knowledge of the cardinal points of the compass. In accomplishing this object, the gigantic strength of the men was taxed to the utmost, nor were the females or the children spared a heavy proportion of the toil. while the sons distributed themselves about the heavily loaded wagons, and drew them by main strength up the neighbouring swell, their mother and Ellen, surrounded by the amazed group of little ones, followed slowly in the rear, bending under the weight of such different articles as were suited to their several strengths. Ishmael himself superintended and directed the whole, occasionally applying his colossal shoulder to some lagging vehicle, until he saw that the chief difficulty, that of gaining the level of their intended route, was accomplished. Then he pointed out the required course, cautioning his sons to proceed in such a manner that they should not lose the advantage they had with so much labour obtained, and beckoning to the brother of his wife, they returned together to the empty camp. Throughout the whole of this movement, which occupied an hour of time, the trapper had stood apart, leaning on his rifle, with the aged hound slumbering at his feet, a silent but attentive observer of all that passed. Occasionally a smile lighted his hard, muscular, but wasted features, like a gleam of sunshine flitting across a ragged ruin, and betrayed the momentary pleasure he found in witnessing from time to time the vast power the youth discovered. Then, as the train drew slowly up the ascent, a cloud of thought and sorrow threw all into the shade again, leaving the expression of his countenance in its usual state of quiet melancholy. As vehicle after vehicle left the place of the encampment, he noted the change with increasing attention, seldom failing to cast an inquiring look at the little neglected tent, which, with its proper wagon, still remained as before, solitary and apparently forgotten. The summons of Ishmael to his gloomy associate had, however, as it would now seem, this hitherto neglected portion of his effects for its objects. First casting a cautious and suspicious glance on every side of him, the squatter and his companion advanced to the little wagon, and caused it to enter within the folds of the cloth, much in the manner that it had been extricated the preceding evening. They both then disappeared behind the drapery, and many moments of suspense succeeded, during which the old man, secretly urged by a burning desire to know the meaning of so much mystery, insensibly drew nigh to the place, until he stood within a few yards of the prescribed spot. The agitation of the cloth betrayed the nature of the occupation of those whom it concealed, though their work was conducted in rigid silence. It would appear that long practice had made each of the two acquainted with his particular duty, for neither sign nor direction of any sort was necessary from Ishmael in order to apprise his surly associate of the manner in which he was to proceed. In less time than has been consummated in relating it, the interior portion of the arrangement was completed, when the men reappeared without the tent. Too busy with his occupation to heed the presence of the trapper, Ishmael began to release the folds of the cloth from the ground, and to dispose of them in such manner around the vehicle as to form a sweeping train to the new form the little pavilion had now assumed. The arch roof trembled with the occasional movement of the light vehicle, which, it was now apparent, once more supported its secret burden. Just as the work was ended, the scowling eye of Ishmael's assistant caught a glimpse of the figure of the attentive observer of their movements. Dropping the shaft, which he had already lifted from the ground, preparatory to occupying the place that was usually filled by an animal less reasoning and perhaps less dangerous than himself, he bluntly exclaimed— "I am a fool, as you often say. But look for yourself. If that man is not an enemy, I will disgrace father and mother, call myself an Indian, and go hunt with the Sioux." The cloud, as it is about to discharge a subtle lightning, is not more dark nor threatening than the look with which Ishmael greeted the intruder. He turned his head on every side of him, as if seeking some engine sufficiently terrible to annihilate the offending trapper at a blow, and then, possibly recollecting the further occasion he might have for his counsel, he forced himself to say, with an appearance of moderation that nearly choked him— "Stranger, I did not believe this prying into concerns of others was the business of women in towns and settlements, and not the manner in which men, who are used to live where each has room for himself, deal with the secrets of their neighbours. To what lawyer or sheriff do you calculate to sell your news?" "I hold but little discourse, except with one, and then chiefly of my own affairs," returned the old man, without the least observable apprehension, and pointing imposingly upward. "A judge, and judge of all. Little does he need knowledge from my hands. and but little will your wish to keep any thing secret from him profit you, even in this desert." The mounting tempers of his unnurtured listeners were rebuked by the simple, solemn manner of the trapper. Ishmael stood sullen and thoughtful, while his companions stole a furtive and involuntary glance at the placid sky, which spread so wide and blue above his head, as if he expected to see the almighty eye itself beaming from the heavenly vault. But impressions of a serious character are seldom lasting on minds long indulged in forgetfulness. The hesitation of the squatter was consequently of short duration. The language, however, as well as the firm and collected air of the speaker, were the means of preventing much subsequent abuse, if not violence. "It would be showing more of the kindness of a friend and comrade," Ishmael returned, in a tone sufficiently sullen to betray his humour, though it was no longer threatening, "had your shoulder been put to the wheel of one of our yonder wagons, instead of edging itself in here, where none are wanted but such as are invited." "I can put the little strength that is left me," returned the trapper, "to this as well as to another of your loads." "Do you take us for boys?" exclaimed Ishmael, laughing, half in ferocity and half in derision, applying his powerful strength at the same time to the little vehicle, which rolled over the grass with as much seeming facility as if it were drawn by its usual team. The trapper paused and followed the departing wagon with his eye, marvelling greatly as to the nature of its concealed contents, until it had also gained the summit of the eminence, and in its turn disappeared behind the swell of the land. Then he turned to gaze at the desolation of the scene around him. The absence of human forms would have scarce created a sensation in the bosom of one so long accustomed to solitude, had not the sight of the deserted camp furnished such strong memorials of its recent visitors, and, as the old man was quick to detect, of their wastes also. He cast his eyes upwards, with a shake of the head, at the vacant spot in the heavens which had so lately been filled by the branches of those trees that now lay stripped of their verdure, worthless and deserted logs, at his feet. "Ay," he muttered to himself, "I might have known it, I might have known it. Often have I seen the same before, and yet I brought them to the spot myself, and have now sent them to the only neighbourhood of their kind within many long leagues of the spot where I stand. This is man's wish, and pride, and waste, and sinfulness. He tames the beasts of the field to feed his idle wants, and having robbed the brutes of their natural food, he teaches them to strip the earth of its trees to quiet their hunger." A rustling in the low bushes which still grew, for some distance, along the swale that formed the thicket on which the camp of Ishmael had rested, caught his ear, at the moment, and cut short the soliloquy. The habits of so many years, spent in the wilderness, caused the old man to bring his rifle to a poise, with something like the activity and promptitude of his youth. But, suddenly recovering his recollection, he dropped it into the hollow of his arm again, and resumed his air of melancholy resignation. Come forth," he said aloud. "Be ye bird, or be ye beast, ye are safe from these old hands. I have eaten and I have drunk. Why should I take life, when my wants call for no sacrifice? It will not be long before the birds will peck at eyes that shall not see them, and perhaps light on my very bones, for if things like these are only made to perish, why am I to expect to live for ever? Come forth, you are safe from harm at these weak hands." "Thank you for the good word, old trapper," cried Paul Hover, springing actively forward from his place of concealment. "There was an air about you, when you threw forward the muzzle of the piece, that I did not like, for it seemed to say that you were master of all the rest of the motions." "You are right," cried the trapper, laughing with inward self-complacency at the recollection of his former skill. "The day has been when few men knew the virtues of a long rifle. Like this I carry, better than myself, old and useless as I now seem. You are right, young man, and the time was when it was dangerous to move a leaf within an earshot of my stand, or," he added, dropping his voice and looking serious, "for a red Mingo to show an eyeball from his ambushment. You have heard of the red Mingoes?" "I have heard of minks," said Paul, taking the old man by the arm, and gently urging him towards the thicket as he spoke, while at the same time he cast quick and uneasy glances behind him, in order to make sure he was not observed. "Of your common black minks, but none of any other colour." Lord, Lord," continued the trapper, shaking his head, and still laughing in his deep but quiet manner, "the boy mistakes a brute for a man, though a Mingo is little better than a beast, or for that matter he is worse, when rum and opportunity are placed before his eyes. There was that accursed Huron from the upper lakes, that I knocked from his perch among the rocks in the hills, back of the hoary—" His voice was lost in a thicket into which he had suffered himself to be led by Paul while speaking, too much occupied by thoughts which dwelt on scenes and acts that had taken place half a century earlier in the history of the country to offer the smallest resistance. Chapter 7. Of the Prairie by James Fenimore Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Peck. Now they are clapper-clawing one another. I'll go look on. That dissembling, abominable varlet, Diomed, has got that same scurvy, doting, foolish, young knave in his helm, Troilus and Cressida. It is necessary, in order that the thread of the narrative should not be spun to a length which might fatigue the reader, that he should imagine a week to have intervened between the scene with which the preceding chapter closed and the events with which it is our intention to resume its relation in this. The season was on point of changing its character, the verdure of summer giving place more rapidly to the brown and party-coloured livery of the fall. Footnote: the Americans call the autumn the fall, from the fall of the leaf. The heavens were clothed in driving clouds, piled in vast masses one above the other, which whirled violently in the gust, opening occasionally to admit transient glimpses of the bright and glorious sight of the heavens, dwelling in a magnificence by far too grand and durable to be disturbed by the fitful efforts of the lower world. Beneath, the wind swept across the wild and naked prairies, with a violence that is seldom witnessed in any section of the continent less open. It would have been easy to imagine, in the ages of fable, that the God of the winds had permitted his subordinate agents to escape from their den, and that they now rioted in wantonness across wastes, where neither tree, nor work of man, nor mountain, nor obstacle of any sort opposed itself to their gambols. Though nakedness might, as usual, be given as a pervading character of the spot, whither it is now necessary to transfer the scene of the tale, it was not entirely without the signs of human life. Amid the monstrous rolling of the prairie, a single naked and ragged rock arose on the margin of a little watercourse, which found its way, after winding a vast distance through the plains, into one of the numerous tributaries of the father of rivers. A swale of low land lay near the base of the eminence, and as it was still fringed with a thicket of alders and sumach, it bore the signs of having once nurtured a feeble growth of wood. The trees themselves had been transferred, however, to the summit and crags of the neighbouring rocks. On this elevation, the signs of man, to which the allusion just made applies, were to be found. Seen from beneath, there were visible a breastwork of logs and stones, intermingled in such a manner as to save all unnecessary labour. A few low roofs made of bark and bough of trees, an occasional barrier, constructed like the defences on the summit, and placed on such points of the acclivity as were easier of approach than the general face of the eminence, and a little dwelling of cloth, perched on the apex of a small pyramid, that shot up at one angle of the rock, the white covering of which glimmered from the distance like a spot of snow, or, to make the simile more suitable to the rest of the subject, like a spotless and carefully guarded standard, which was to be protected by the dearest blood of those who defended the citadel beneath. It is hardly necessary to add, that this rude and characteristic fortress was the place where Ishmael Bush had taken refuge, after the robbery of his flocks and herds. On the day to which the narrative is advanced, the squatter was standing near the base of the rocks, leaning on his rifle, and regarding the sterile soil that supported him with a look in which contempt and disappointment were strongly blended. "'Tis time to change our natures," he observed to the brother of his wife, who was rarely far from his elbow, "and to become ruminators, instead of people used to the fare of Christians and free men. I reckon, Abiram, you could glean a living among the grasshoppers.
You are an active man, and might outrun the nimblest skipper of them all." "The country will never do," returned the other, who relished but little the forced humour of his kinsman, "and it is well to remember that a lazy traveller makes a long journey." "Would you have me draw a cart at my heels, across this desert, for weeks, ay, months?" retorted Ishmael, who, like all of his class, could labour with incredible efforts on emergencies, but who too seldom exerted continued industry, on any occasion, to brook a proposal that offered so little repose. "It may do for your people, who live in settlements, to hasten unto their houses; but, thank Heaven, my farm is too big for its owner ever to want a resting place." "Since you like the plantation, then, you have only to make your crop." "That is easier said than done, on this corner of the estate. I tell you, Abiram, there is need of moving, for more reasons than one. You know I am a man that very seldom enters into a bargain, but who always fulfils his agreements better than your dealers in worldly contracts written on rags of paper. If there's 1 mile, there are 100 still needed to make up the distance for which you have my honour." As he spoke, the squatter glanced his eye upward at the little tenement of cloth which crowned the summit of his ragged fortress. The look was understood and answered by the other, and by some secret influence, which operated either through their interest or feelings, it served to re-establish that harmony between them, which had just been threatened with something like a momentary breach. "I know it, and feel it in every bone of my body, but I remember the reason why I have set myself on this accursed journey too well to forget the distance between me and the end. Neither you nor I will ever be the better for what we have done, unless we thoroughly finish what is so well begun. Ay, that is the doctrine of the whole world, I judge. I heard a travelling preacher, who was skirting it down the Ohio, a time since, say, if a man should live up to the faith for 100 years, and then fall from his work a single day, he would find the settlement was to be made for the finishing blow that he had put to his job, and that all the bad and none of the good would come into the final account." "And you believe the hungry hypocrite?" "Who said that I believed it?" retorted Abiram, with a bullying look, that betrayed how much his fears had dwelt on the subject he affected to despise. "Is it believing to tell what a roguish? And yet, Ishmael, the man might have been honest after all. He told us that the world was, in truth, no better than a desert, and that there was but one hand that could lead the most learned man through all its crooked windings. Now, if this be true of the whole, it may be true of a part." "Abiram, out with your grievances like a man," interrupted the squatter, with a hoarse laugh. "You want to pray? But of what use will it be, according to your own doctrine, to serve God 5 minutes and the devil an hour? Harkee, friend, I'm not much of a husbandman, but this I know to my cost, that to make a right good crop, even on the richest bottom, there must be hard labour. And your snufflers liken the 'arth to a field of corn, and the men who live on it to its yield. Now I tell you, Abiram, that you are no better than a thistle or a mullein. Yea, you are wood of too open a pore to be good, even to burn." The malign glance, which shot from the scowling eye of Abiram, announced the angry character of his feelings, but as the furtive look quailed, immediately, before the unmoved steady countenance of the squatter, it also betrayed how much the bolder spirit of the latter had obtained the mastery over his craven nature. Content with his ascendancy, which was too apparent, and had been too often exerted on similar occasions, to leave him in any doubt of its extent, Ishmael coolly continued the discourse, by adverting more directly to his future plans. "You will own the justice of paying every one in kind," he said. "I have been robbed of my stock, and I have a scheme to make myself as good as before, by taking a hoof for hoof. Or, for that matter, when a man is put to the trouble of bargaining for both sides, he is a fool if he doesn't pay himself something in the way of commission." As the squatter made this declaration in a tone which was a little excited by the humour of the moment, 4 or 5 of his lounging sons, who had been leaning against the foot of the rock, came forward with the indolent step so common to the family. "I have been calling Ellen Wade, who is on the rock, keeping a look-out, to know if there is anything to be seen," observed the eldest of the young men, "and she shakes her head for an answer. Ellen is sparing of her words for a woman, and might be taught manners at least, without spoiling her good looks." Ishmael cast his eye upward to the place where the offending but unconscious girl was holding her anxious watch. She was seated at the edge of the uppermost crag by the side of the little tent, and at least 200 feet above the level of the plain.
Little else was to be distinguished, at that distance, but the outline of her form, her fair hair streaming in the gusts beyond her shoulders, and the steady and seemingly unchangeable look that she had riveted on some remote point of the prairie. "What is it, Nell?" cried Ishmael, lifting his powerful voice a little above the rushing of the element. "Have you got a glimpse of anything bigger than a burrowing barker?" The lips of the attentive Ellen parted. She rose to the utmost height her small stature admitted, seeming still to regard the unknown object, but her voice, if she spoke at all, was not sufficiently loud to be heard amid the wind. "It are a fact that the child sees something more uncommon than a buffalo or a prairie dog," continued Ishmael. "Why now, girl, are ye deaf? Now, I say, I hope it is an army of redskins she has in her eye, for I should relish the chance to pay them for their kindness, under the favour of these logs and rocks." As the squatter accompanied his vaunt with corresponding gestures, and directed his eyes to the circle of his equally confident sons while speaking, he drew their gaze from Ellen to himself. But now, when they turned together to note the succeeding movements of their female sentinel, the place, which had so lately been occupied by her form, was vacant. "As I am a sinner!" exclaimed Massa, usually one of the most phlegmatic of the youths, "the girl is blown away by the wind!" Something like a sensation was exhibited among them, which might have denoted that the influence of the laughing blue eyes, flaxen hair, and glowing cheeks of Ellen had not been lost on the dull natures of the young men, and looks of amazement, mingled slightly with concern, passed from one to the other as they gazed, in dull wonder, at the point of the naked rock. "It might well be," added another. "She sat on a silvered stone, and I've been thinking of telling her she was in danger for more than an hour." "Is that a riband of the child, dangling from the corner of the hill below?" cried Ishmael. "Ha! Who is moving about the tent? Have I not told you all—" "Ellen! 'Tis Ellen!" interrupted the whole body of his sons in a breath, and at that instant she reappeared, to put an end to their different surmises, and to relieve more than one sluggish nature from its unwonted excitement. As Ellen issued from beneath the folds of the tent, she advanced with a light and fearless step to her former giddy stand, and pointed toward the prairie, appearing to speak in an eager and rapid voice to some invisible auditor. "Nell is mad," said Asa, half in contempt, and yet not a little in concern. "The girl's dreaming with her eyes open, and thinks she sees one of them fierce creatures, with hard names, with which the doctor fills her ears." "Can it be, the child has found a scout of the Sioux?" said Ishmael, bending his look toward the plain. But a low, significant whisper from Abiram drew his eyes quickly upward again, where they were turned just in time to perceive that the cloth of the tent was agitated by a motion very evidently different from the quivering occasioned by the wind. "Let her, if she dare," the squatter muttered in his teeth. "Abiram, they know my temper too well to play the prank with me." "Look for yourself. If the curtain is not lifted, I can see no better than the owl by daylight." Ishmael struck the breech of his rifle violently on the earth, and shouted in a voice that might easily have been heard by Ellen, had not her attention still continued rapt on the object which so unaccountably attracted her eyes in the distance. "Nell!" continued the squatter, "away with you, fool! Will you bring down punishment on your own head? Why, Nell? She has forgotten her native speech. Let us see if she can understand another language." Ishmael threw his rifle to his shoulder, and at the next moment it was pointed upward at the summit of the rock. Before time was given for a word of remonstrance, it had sent forth its contents in its usual streak of bright flame. Ellen started like the frightened chamois, and uttering a piercing scream, she darted into the tent, with a swiftness that left it uncertain whether terror or actual injury had been the penalty of her offence. The action of the squatter was too sudden and unexpected to admit of prevention, but the instant it was done, his sons manifested, in an unequivocal manner, the temper with which they witnessed the desperate measure. Angry and fierce glances were interchanged, and a murmur of disapprobation was uttered by the whole in common. "What has Ellen done, father?" asked Asa, with a degree of spirit which was the more striking from being unusual. "That she should be shot like a straggling deer, or a hungry wolf?" "Mischief!" deliberately returned the squatter, but with a cool expression of defiance in his eye that showed how little he was moved by the ill-concealed humour of his children. "Mischief, boy, mischief! Take you heed that the disorder don't spread." "It would need a different treatment in a man, than in yon screaming girl." "Asa, you are a man, as you have often boasted, but remember I am your father, and your better." "I know it well, and what sort of a father." "Harkee, boy,
I more than half believe that your drowsy head let in the Sioux. Be modest in speech, my watchful son, or you may have to answer yet for the mischief your own bad conduct has brought upon us." "I'll stay no longer to be hectored like a child in petticoats. You talk of law, as if you knew of none, and yet you keep me down, as though I had not life and wants of my own. I stay no longer to be treated like one of your meanest cattle. The world is wide, my gallant boy, and there's many a noble plantation on it, without a tenant. Go! You have title deeds, signed and sealed to your hand. Few fathers portion their children better than Ishmael Bush. You will say that for me, at least, when you get to be a wealthy landholder." "Look, father, look!" exclaimed several voices at once, seizing with avidity an opportunity to interrupt a dialogue which threatened to become more violent. "Look!" repeated Abiram in a voice which sounded hollow and warning. "If you have time for anything but quarrels, Ishmael, look!" The squatter turned slowly from his offending son, and cast an eye that still lowered with deep resentment upward, but which, the instant it caught a view of the object that now attracted the attention of all around him, changed its expression to one of astonishment and dismay. A female stood on the spot from which Ellen had been so fearfully expelled. Her person was of the smallest size that is believed to comport with beauty, and which poets and artists have chosen as the beau ideal of feminine loveliness. Her dress was of a dark and glossy silk, and fluttered like gossamer around her form. Long, flowing, and curling tresses of hair, still blacker and more shining than her robe, fell at times about her shoulders, completely enveloping the whole of her delicate bust in their ringlets, or at others streaming in the wind. The elevation at which she stood prevented a close examination of the lineaments of a countenance which, however, it might be seen was youthful, and at the moment of her unlooked-for appearance, eloquent with feeling. So young, indeed, did this fair and fragile being appear, that it might be doubted whether the age of childhood was entirely past. One small and exquisitely moulded hand was pressed on her heart, while with the other she made an impressive gesture, which seemed to invite Ishmael, if further violence was meditated, to direct it against her bosom. The silent wonder, with which the group of boarders gazed upwards at so extraordinary a spectacle, was only interrupted as the person of Ellen was seen emerging with timidity from the tent, as if equally urged by apprehensions in behalf of herself and the fears which she felt on account of her companion, to remain concealed and to advance. She spoke, but her words were unheard by those below, and unheeded by her to whom they were addressed. The latter, however, as if content with the offer she had made of herself as a victim to the resentment of Ishmael, now calmly retired, and the spot she had so lately occupied became vacant, leaving a sort of stupid impression on the spectators beneath, not unlike that which it might be supposed would have been created had they just been gazing at some supernatural vision. More than a minute of profound silence succeeded, during which the sons of Ishmael still continued gazing at the naked rock in stupid wonder. Then, as eye met eye, an expression of novel intelligence passed from one to the other, indicating that to them, at least, the appearance of this extraordinary tenant of the pavilion was as unexpected as it was incomprehensible. At length, Asa, in right of his years, and moved by the rankling impulse of the recent quarrel, took on himself the office of interrogator. Instead, however, of braving the resentment of his father, of whose fierce nature, when aroused, he had too frequent evidence to excite it wantonly, he turned upon the cowering person of Abiram, observing with a sneer— "This then is the beast you were bringing into the prairies for a decoy. I know you to be a man who seldom troubles truth, when anything worse may answer. But I never knew you to outdo yourself so thoroughly before. The newspapers of Kentuck have called you a dealer in black flesh 100 times. But little did they reckon that you drove the trade into white families." "Who is a kidnapper?" demanded Abiram, with a blustering show of resentment. "Am I to be called account for every lie they put in print throughout the States? Look to your own family, boy. Look to yourselves. The very stumps of Kentucky and Tennessee cry out agent in ye. Ay, my tonguey gentlemen, I have seen father and mother and 3 children, yourself for one, published on the logs and stubs of the settlements, with dollars enough for reward to have made an honest man rich, for—" He was interrupted by a backhanded but violent blow on the mouth, that caused him to totter, and which left the impression of its weight in the starting blood and swelling lips. "Asa!"
said the father, advancing with a portion of that dignity with which the hand of nature seems to have invested the parental character. "You have struck the brother of your mother!" "I have struck the abuser of the whole family," returned the angry youth; "and unless he teaches his tongue a wiser language, he had better part with it altogether, as the unruly member. I'm no great performer with the knife, but, on an occasion, could make out, myself, to cut off a slant. Boy, twice have you forgotten yourself to-day. Be careful that it does not happen the third time. When the law of the land is weak, it is right the law of nature should be strong. You understand me, Asa, and you know me. As for you, Abiram, the child has done you wrong, and it is my place to see you righted. Remember, I tell you justice shall be done. It is enough. But you have said hard things aging me and my family. If the hounds of the law had put their bills on the trees and stumps of the clearings, it was for no act of dishonesty, as you know, but because we maintain the rule that 'arth is common property. No, Abiram, could I wash my hands of things done by your advice, as easily as I can of the things done by the whisperings of the devil. My sleep would be quieter at night, and none who bear my name would need blush to hear it mentioned. Peace, Asa, and you too, man. Enough has been said. Let us all think well before anything is added, that may make what is already so bad still more bitter." Ishmael waved his hand with authority, as he ended, and turned away with the air of one who felt assured that those he had addressed would not have the temerity to dispute his commands. Asa evidently struggled with himself to compel the required obedience, but his heavy nature quietly sunk into its ordinary repose, and he soon appeared again, the being he really was, dangerous only at moments, and one whose passions were too sluggish to be maintained at the point of ferocity. Not so with Abiram. While there was an appearance of personal conflict between him and his colossal nephew, his mien had expressed the infallible evidences of engrossing apprehension. But now, that the authority as well as gigantic strength of the father were interposed between him and his assailant, his countenance changed from paleness to a livid hue, that bespoke how deeply the injury he had received rankled in his breast. Like Asa, however, he acquiesced in the decision of the squatter, and the appearance, at least, of harmony was restored again among a set of beings, who were restrained by no obligations more powerful than the frail web of authority with which Ishmael had been able to envelope his children. One effect of the quarrel had been to divert the thoughts of the young men from their recent visitor. With the dispute that succeeded the disappearance of the fair stranger, all recollection of her existence appeared to have vanished. A few ominous and secret conferences, it is true, were held apart, during which the direction of the eyes of the different speakers betrayed their subject. But these threatening symptoms soon disappeared, and the whole party was again seen broken into its usual listless, silent, and lounging groups. "I will go upon the rock, boys, and look abroad for the savages," said Ishmael shortly after, advancing towards them with a mien which he intended should be conciliating, at the same time that it was authoritative. "If there is nothing to fear, we will go out on the plain. The day is too good to be lost in words, like women in the towns wrangling over their tea and sugar cakes." Without waiting for approbation or dissent, the squatter advanced to the base of the rock, which formed a sort of perpendicular wall, nearly 20 feet high around the whole acclivity. Ishmael, however, directed his footsteps to a point where, on the ascent, might be made through a narrow cleft, which he had taken the precaution to fortify with a breastwork of cottonwood logs, and which in its turn was defended by a chevaux de frise of the branches of the same tree. Here an armed man was usually kept, as at the key of the whole position, and here one of the young men now stood, indolently leaning against the rock, ready to protect the pass, if it should prove necessary, until the whole party could be mustered at the several points of defence. From this place the squatter found the ascent still difficult, partly by nature, and partly by artificial impediments, until he reached a sort of terrace, or, to speak more properly, the plain of the elevation, where he had established the huts in which the whole family dwelt. These tenements were, as already mentioned, of that class which are so often seen on the borders, and such as belong to the infancy of architecture, being simply formed of logs, bark, and poles. The area on which they stood contained several hundred square feet, and was sufficiently elevated above the plain, greatly to lessen, if not to remove, all danger from Indian missiles. Here Ishmael believed he might leave his infants in comparative security, under the protection of their spirited mother, and here he now found Esther engaged at her ordinary domestic employments, surrounded by her daughters, and lifting her voice in declamatory censure, as one or another of the idle fry incurred her displeasure, and far too much engrossed with the tempest of her own conversation to know anything of the violent scene which had been passing below. "A fine windy place you have chosen for the camp, Ishmael," she commented, or rather continued, by merely diverting the attack from a sobbing girl of 10, at her elbow, to her husband. "My word! If I haven't to count the young ones every 10 minutes to see they are not flying away among the buzzards, or the ducks, why do ye all keep hovering around the rock, like lolloping reptiles in the spring, when the heavens are beginning to be alive with birds, man? Do ye think mouths can be filled and hunger satisfied by laziness and sleep?" "You'll have your say, Esther," said the husband, using the provincial pronunciation of America for the name, and regarding his noisy companions with a look of habitual tolerance rather than of affection. "But the birds you shall have, if your own tongue don't frighten them to take too high a flight. Ay, woman," he continued, standing on the very spot whence he had so rudely banished Ellen, which he had by this time gained. "And buffalo, too, if my eye can tell the animal at the distance of a Spanish league. Come down, and be doing instead of talking. A talking man is no better than a barking dog. I shall hang out the cloth, if any of the redskins show themselves in time to give you notice. But, Ishmael, what have you been killing, my man? For it was your rifle I heard a few minutes agone, unless I have lost my skill in sounds. Poh! 'Twas to frighten the hawk you see sailing above the rock." "Hawk, indeed! At your time of day to be shooting at hawks and buzzards, with 18 open mouths to feed! Look at the bee, and at the beaver, my good man, and learn to be a provider. Why, Ishmael, I believe my soul," she continued, dropping the toe she was twisting on a distaff, "the man is in that tent again. More than half his time is spent about the worthless, good-for-nothing—" The sudden reappearance of her husband closed the mouth of the wife, and, as the former descended to the place where Esther had resumed her employment, she was content to grumble forth her dissatisfaction, instead of expressing it in more audible terms. The dialogue that now took place between the affectionate pair was sufficiently succinct and expressive. The woman was at first a little brief and sullen in her answers, but care for her family soon rendered her more complaisant. As the purport of the conversation was merely an engagement to hunt during the remainder of the day, in order to provide the chief necessary of life, we shall not stop to record it. With this resolution, then, the squatter descended to the plain, and divided his forces into 2 parts, one of which was to remain as a guard with the fortress, and the other to accompany him to the field. He warily included Asa and Abiram in his own party, well knowing that no authority short of his own was competent to repress the fierce disposition of his headlong son, if fairly awakened. When these arrangements were completed, the hunters sallied forth, separating at no great distance from the rock, in order to form a circle about the distant herd of buffaloes. End of chapter 8. Of the Prairie by James Fenimore Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Peck. Priscian a little scratched, 'twill serve. Love's labour lost. Having made the reader acquainted with the manner in which Ishmael Bush had disposed of his family, under circumstances that might have proved so embarrassing to most other men, we shall again shift the scene a few short miles from the place last described, preserving, however, the due and natural succession of time. At the very moment that the squatter and his sons departed in the manner mentioned in the preceding chapter, 2 men were intently occupied in a swale that lay along the borders of a little run, just out of cannon shot from the encampment, discussing the merits of a savoury bison hump, that had been prepared for their palates with the utmost attention to the particular merits of that description of food. The choice morsel had been judiciously separated from the adjoining and less worthy parts of the beast, and, enveloped in the hairy coating provided by nature, it had duly undergone the heat of the customary subterraneous oven, and was now laid before its proprietors in all the culinary glory of the prairies. So far as richness, delicacy, and wildness of flavour, and substantial nourishment were concerned, The viand might well have claimed a decided superiority over the meticulous cookery and laboured compounds of the most renowned artists, though the service of the dainty was certainly achieved in a manner far from artificial. It would appear that the two fortunate mortals, to whose happy lot it fell to enjoy a meal in which health and appetite lent so keen a relish to the exquisite food of the American deserts, were far from being insensible of the advantage they possessed. The one, to whose knowledge in the culinary art the other was indebted for his banquet, seemed the least disposed of the two to profit by his own skill. He ate, it is true, and with relish, but it was always with the moderation with which age is apt to temper the appetite. No such restraint, however, was imposed on the inclination of his companion. In the very flower of his days, and in the vigour of manhood, the homage that he paid to the work of his more aged friend's hands was of the most profound and engrossing character. As one delicious morsel succeeded another, he rolled his eyes towards his companion, and seemed to express that gratitude, which he had not speech to utter, in looks of the most benignant nature. "Cut more into the heart of it, lad," said the trapper, for it was the venerable inhabitant of those vast wastes who had served the bee hunter with the banquet in question. "Cut more into the centre of the piece; there you will find the genuine riches of nature, and that without need from spices, or any of your biting mustard to give it a foreign relish." "If I had but a cup of metheglin," said Paul, stopping to perform the necessary operation of breathing, "I should swear this was the strongest meal that was ever placed before the mouth of man." "Ay, ay, well you may call it strong," returned the other, laughing after his peculiar manner, in pure satisfaction at witnessing the infinite contentment of his companion. "Strong it is, and strong it makes him who eats it. Here, Hector," tossing the patient hound, who was watching his eye with a wistful look, a portion of the meat. "You have now need of strength, my friend, in your old days as well as your master. Now, lad, there is a dog that has eaten and slept wiser and better, ay, and that of richer food, than any king of them all. And why? Because he had used and not abused the gifts of his Maker. He was made a hound, and like a hound has he feasted. Then did He create men, but they have eaten like famished wolves. A good and prudent dog has Hector proved, and never have I found one of his breed false in nose or friendship. Do you know the difference between the cookery of the wilderness and that which is found in the settlements? No, I see plainly you don't, by your appetite. Then I will tell you. The one follows man, the other nature. One thinks he can add to the gifts of the Creator, while the other is humble enough to enjoy them. Therein lies the secret." "I tell you, trapper," said Paul, who was very little edified by the morality with which his associates saw fit to season their repast, "that, every day, while we are in this place, and they are likely to be many, I will shoot a buffaloe, and you shall cook his hump." "I cannot say that. The beast is good, take him in what part you will, and it was to be food for men, that he was fashioned, but I cannot say that I will be a witness and a helper to the waste of killing one daily." "The devil a bit of waste shall there be, old man. If they all turn out as good as this, I will engage to eat them clean myself, even to the hoofs. How now, who comes here? Some one with a long nose, I will answer, and one that has led him on a true scent, if he is following the trail of a dinner." The individual who interrupted the conversation, and who had elicited the foregoing remark of Paul, was seen advancing along the margin of the run, with a deliberate pace, in a direct line for the two revellers. As there was nothing formidable nor hostile in his appearance, the bee hunter, instead of suspending his operations, rather increased his efforts, in a manner which would seem to imply that he doubted whether the hump would suffice for the proper entertainment of all who were now likely to partake of the delicious morsel. With the trapper, however, the case was different. His more tempered appetite was already satisfied, and he faced the newcomer with a look of cordiality, that plainly evinced how very opportune he considered his arrival. "Come on, friend," he said, waving his hand as he observed the stranger to pause a moment, apparently in doubt. "Come on, I say, if hunger be your guide. It has led you to a fitting place. Here is meat, and this youth can give you corn, parched till it be whiter than the upland snow. Come on, without fear. We are not ravenous beasts, eating of each other, but Christian men, receiving thankfully that which the Lord hath seen fit to give."
"Venerable hunter,"
returned the doctor, for it was no other than the naturalist, on one of his daily exploring expeditions,
"I rejoice greatly at this happy meeting. We are lovers of the same pursuits, and should be friends."
"Lord, Lord," said the old man, laughing, without much deference to the rules of decorum, in the philosopher's very face, "it is man who wanted to make me believe that the name could change the nature of a beast. Come, friend, you are welcome, though your notions are a little blinded with reading too many books. Sit ye down, and after eating of this morsel tell me, if you can, the name of the creature that has bestowed on you its flesh for a meal." The eyes of Dr. Battius, for we deem it decorous to give the good man the appellation he most preferred, sufficiently denoted the satisfaction with which he listened to this proposal. The exercise he had taken, and the sharpness of the wind, proved excellent stimulants, and Paul himself had hardly been in better plight to do credit to the trapper's cookery than was the lover of nature, when the grateful invitation met his ears. Indulging in a small laugh, which his exertions to repress reduced nearly to a simper, he took the indicated seat by the old man's side, and made the customary dispositions to commence his meal without further ceremony.
"I should be ashamed of my profession,"
he said, swallowing a morsel of the hump, with evident delight, slyly endeavouring at the same time to distinguish the peculiarities of the singed and defaced skin.
"I ought to be ashamed of my profession, were there beast or bird on the continent of America that I could not tell by some one of the many evidences which science has elicited in her cause. This, then, the food is nutritious and savoury. A mouthful of your corn, friend, if you please."
Paul, who continued eating with increasing industry, looking askant not unlike a dog when engaged in some agreeable pursuit, threw him his pouch, without deeming it at all necessary to suspend his own labours. "You were saying, friend, that you have many ways of telling the creature?" observed the attentive trapper.
"Many, many, and infallible. Now, the animals that are carnivorous are known by their incisors."
"Their what?" demanded the trapper.
"The teeth with which nature has furnished them for defence, and in order to tear their food. Again—"
"Look you, then, for the teeth of this creature," interrupted the trapper, who was bent on convincing a man who had presumed to enter into competition with himself, in matters pertaining to the wilds of gross ignorance. "Turn the piece around and find your inside overs." The doctor complied, and of course without success, though he profited by the occasion to take another fruitless glance at the wrinkled hide. "Well, friend, do you find the things you need before you can pronounce the creatures a duck or a salmon?"
"I apprehend the entire animal is not here."
"You may as well say as much," cried Paul, who was now compelled to pause from pure repletion. "I will answer for some pounds of the fellow, weighed by the truest steel yards west of the Alleghanies."
"Still you may make out to keep soul and body together, with what is left,"
reluctantly eyeing a piece large enough to feed 20 men, but which he felt compelled to abandon from satiety. "Cut in nigher to the heart, as the old man says, and you will find the riches of the piece."
"The heart?"
exclaimed the doctor, inwardly delighted to learn that there was a distinct organ to be submitted to his inspection.
"Ay, let me see, the heart. It will at once determine the character of the animal. Certes, this is not the core, eh? Sure enough it is. The animal must be of the order Belluae, from its obese habits."
He was interrupted by a long and hearty, but still a noiseless fit of merriment from the trapper, which was considered so ill-timed by the offended naturalist as to produce an instant cessation of speech, if not a stagnation of ideas. "Listen to his beasts, habits, and belly orders," said the old man, delighted with the evident embarrassment of his rival. "And then he says it's not the core. Why, man, you are farther from the truth than you are from the settlements, with all your bookish laming and hard words, which I have, once for all, said cannot be understood by any tribe or nation east of the Rocky Mountains. Beastly habits or no beastly habits, the creatures are to be seen cropping the prairies by tens of thousands, and the piece in your hand is the core of as juicy a buffalo hump as stomach need crave."
"My aged companion,"
said Obed, struggling to keep down the rising irascibility that he conceived would ill comport with the dignity of his character,
"your system is erroneous, from the premises to the conclusion, and your classification so faulty as utterly to confound the distinctions of science. The buffalo is not gifted with a hump at all, nor is his flesh savoury and wholesome, as I must acknowledge it would seem the subject before us may well be characterized." "There I'm dead against you, and clearly with the trapper," interrupted Paul Hover. "The man who denies that buffalo beef is good, should scorn to eat it." Footnote: It is scarcely necessary to tell the reader that the animal so often alluded to in this book, and which is vulgarly called the buffalo, is in truth the bison. Hence so many contempts between the men of the prairies and the men of science. The doctor, whose observation of the bee hunter had hitherto been exceedingly cursory, stared at the new speaker with a look which denoted something like recognition. "The principal characteristics of your countenance, friend," he said, "are familiar. Either you, or some other specimen of your class, is known to me." "I am the man you met in the woods east of the big river, and whom you tried to persuade to line a yellow hornet to his nest. As if my eye was not too true to mistake any other animal for a honey bee in a clear day. We tarried together a week, as you may remember, you at your toads and lizards, and I at my high holes and hollow trees. And a good job we made of it between us. I filled my tubs with the sweetest honey I ever sent to the settlements, besides housing a dozen hives. And your bag was near bursting with a crawling museum. I never was bold enough to put the question to your face, stranger, but I reckon you are a keeper of curiosities." Footnote: The pursuit of a bee hunter is not uncommon on the skirts of American society, though it is a little embellished here. When the bees are seen sucking the flowers, their pursuer contrives to capture one or two. He then chooses a proper spot, and suffering one to escape, the insect invariably takes its flight towards the hive. Changing his ground to a greater or less distance according to circumstances, the bee hunter then permits another to escape. Having watched the course of the bees, which is technically called lining, he is enabled to calculate the intersecting angle of the two lines, which is the hive. "Ay, that is another of their wanton wickedness," exclaimed the trapper. "They slay the buck and the moose and the wildcat and all the beasts that range the woods, and stuffing them with worthless rags, and placing eyes of glass into their heads, that they set them up to be stared at, and call them the creatures of the Lord, as if any mortal effigy could equal the works of his hand." "I know you well," returned the doctor, on whom the plaint of the old man produced no visible impression. "I know you," offering his hand cordially to Paul. "It was a prolific week, as my herbal and catalogue shall one day prove. Ay, I remember well, young man, you are of the class Mammalia, order Primates, genus Homo, species Kentucky." Pausing to smile at his own humour, the naturalist proceeded. "Since our separation, I have journeyed far, having entered into a compactum or agreement with a certain man named Ishmael." "Bush!" interrupted the impatient and reckless Paul. "By the Lord, trapper, this is the very blood letter that Ellen told me of." "Then Nelly has not done me credit for what I trust I deserve," returned the single-minded doctor, "for I am not of the phlebotomizing school at all, greatly preferring the practice which purifies the blood, instead of abstracting it." "It was a blunder of mine, good stranger. The girl called you a skilful man." "Therein she may have exceeded my merits," Dr. Battius continued, bowing with sufficient meekness, "but Ellen is good and kind, and a spirited girl too. A kind and a sweet girl I have ever found Nell Wade to be." "The devil you have!" cried Paul, dropping the morsel he was sucking, from sheer reluctance to abandon the hump, and casting a fierce and direct look into the very teeth of the unconscious physician. "I reckon, stranger, you have a mind to bag Ellen too." "The riches of the whole vegetable and animal world united would not tempt me to harm a hair of her head. I love the child, with what may be called amor naturalis, or rather paternus, the affection of a father." "Ay, that indeed is more befitting the difference in your years," Paul coolly rejoined, stretching forth his hand to regain the rejected morsel. "You would be no better than a drone at your time of day, with a young hive to feed and swarm." "Yes, there is reason because there is nature, in what he says," observed the trapper. "But, friend, you have said you were a dweller in the camp of one Ishmael Bush?" "True, it is in the virtue of compactum." "I know but little of the virtue of packing, though I follow trapping, in my old age, for a livelihood. They tell me that skins are well kept in the new fashion, but it is long since I have left off killing more than I need for food and garments.
I was an eye-witness myself of the manner in which the Sioux broke into your encampment, and drove off the cattle, stripping the poor man you call Ishmael of his smallest hoofs, counting even the cloven feet." "Asinus excepted," muttered the doctor, who by this time was discussing his portion of the hump, in utter forgetfulness of all its scientific attributes. "Asinus domesticus Americanus excepted." "I'm glad to hear that so many of them are saved, though I know not the value of the animals you name, which is nothing uncommon, seeing how long it is that I have been out of the settlements. But can you tell me, friend, what the traveller carries under the white cloth he guards with teeth as sharp as a wolf that quarrels for the carcass the hunter has left?" "You heard of it?" exclaimed the other, dropping the morsel he was conveying to his mouth in manifest surprise. "Nay, I have heard nothing, but I have seen the cloth, and had like to have been bitten for no greater crime than wishing to know what it covered." "Bitten! Then after all the animal must be carnivorous. It is too tranquil for Ursus horridus. If it were the Canis latrans, the voice would betray it, nor would Nelly Wade be so familiar with any of the genus Fadae. Venerable hunter, the solitary animal confined in that wagon by day, and in the tent at night, has occasioned me more perplexity of mind than the whole catalogue of quadrupeds besides, and for this plain reason: I did not know how to class it." "You think it a ravenous beast?" "I know it to be quadruped. Your own danger proves it to be carnivorous." During this broken explanation, Paul Hover had sat silent and thoughtful, regarding each speaker with deep attention. But suddenly, moved by the manner of the doctor, the latter had scarcely time to utter his positive assertion, before the young man bluntly demanded— "And pray, friend, what may you call a quadruped?" "A vagary of nature, wherein she has displayed less of her infinite wisdom than is usual. Could rotary levers be substituted for two of the limbs, agreeably to the improvement in my new order of phalangochura, which might be rendered into the vernacular as lever-legged, there would be a delightful perfection and harmony in the construction. But as the quadruped is now formed, I call it a mere vagary of nature, no other than a vagary." "Harkee, stranger, in Kentucky we are but small dealers in dictionaries. Vagary is a hard word to turn into English as quadruped." "A quadruped is an animal with 4 legs, a beast." "A beast! Do you then reckon that Ishmael Bush travels with a beast caged in that wagon?" "I know it, and lend me your ear. Not literally, friend," observing Paul to start and look surprised, "but figuratively through its functions, and you shall hear. I have already made known, that in the virtue of a compactum, I journey with the aforesaid Ishmael Bush. But though I am bound to perform certain duties while the journey lasts, there is no condition which says that the said journey shall be sempiternum, or eternal. Now, though this region may scarcely be said to be wedded to science, being to all intents a virgin territory as respects the enquirer into natural history, still it is greatly destitute of the treasures of the vegetable kingdom. I should therefore have tarried some hundreds of miles more to the eastward, were it not for the inward propensity that I feel to have the beast in question inspected and suitably described and classed. For that matter," he continued, dropping his voice, like one who imparts an important secret, "I am not without hopes of persuading Ishmael to let me dissect it." "You have seen the creature?" "Not with the organs of sight, but with much more infallible instruments of vision, the conclusions of reason and the deductions of scientific premises. I have watched the habits of the animal, young man, and can fearlessly pronounce, by evidence that would be thrown away on ordinary observers, that it is of vast dimensions, inactive, possibly torpid, of voracious appetite, and, as it now appears, by the direct testimony of this venerable hunter, ferocious and carnivorous." "I should be better pleased, stranger," said Paul, on whom the doctor's description was making a very sensible impression, "to be sure the creature was a beast at all." "As to that, if I wanted evidence of a fact, which is abundantly apparent by the habits of the animal, I have the word of Ishmael himself. A reason can be given for my smallest deductions. I am not troubled, young man, with a vulgar and idle curiosity, but all my aspirations after knowledge, as I humbly believe, are, first, for the advancement of learning, and secondly, for the benefit of my fellow creatures. I pine greatly in secret to know the contents of the tent, which Ishmael guarded so carefully, and which he had covenanted that I should swear, jure per Deos, not to approach nigher than a defined number of cubits,
for a definite period of time. Your just gerundum, or oath, is a serious matter, and not to be dealt in lightly. But, as my expedition depended on complying, I consented to the act, reserving to myself at all times the power of distant observation. It is now some 10 days since Ishmael, pitying the state in which he saw me, a humble lover of science, imparted the fact that the vehicle contained a beast, which he was carrying into the prairies as a decoy, by which he intends to entrap others of the same genus, or perhaps species. Since then, my task has been reduced simply to watch the habits of the animal and to record the results. When we reach a certain distance where these beasts are said to abound, I am to have the liberal examination of the specimen."
Paul continued to listen in the most profound silence, until the doctor concluded his singular but characteristic explanation. Then the incredulous bee-hunter shook his head, and saw fit to reply by saying, "Stranger, old Ishmael has burrowed you in the very bottom of the hollow tree, where your eyes will be of no more use than the sting of a drone. I too know something of that very wagon, and I may say that I have lined the squatter down into a flat line. Harkee, friend, do you think the girl, like Ellen Wade, would become the companion of a wild beast?" "Why not? Why not?" repeated the naturalist. "Nelly has a taste, and often listens with pleasure to the treasures that I am sometimes compelled to scatter in this desert. Why should she not study the habits of any animal, even though it were a rhinoceros?" "Softly, softly," returned the equally positive, and though less scientific, certainly, on this subject, better instructed bee-hunter. "Ellen is a girl spirit, and one too that knows her own mind, or I'm much mistaken. But with all her courage and brave looks, she is no better than a woman after all. Haven't I often had the girl crying—"
"You are an acquaintance, then, of Nelly's?"
"The devil a bit. But I know a woman is a woman, and all the books in Kentucky couldn't make Ellen Wade go into a tent alone with a ravenous beast."
"It seems to me," the trapper calmly observed, "that there is something dark and hidden in this matter. I am a witness that the traveller likes none to look into the tent, and I have a proof more sure than what either of you can lay claim to, that the wagon does not carry the cage of a beast. Here is Hector, come of a breed with noses as true and faithful as a hand that is all-powerful has made any of their kind, and had there been a beast in the place, the hound would long since have told it to his master." "Do you pretend to oppose a dog to a man? Brutality to learning? Instinct to reason?" exclaimed the doctor in some heat. "In what manner, pray, can a hound distinguish the habits, species, or even the genus of an animal, like reasoning, learned, scientific, triumphant man?" "In what manner?" coolly repeated the veteran woodsman. "Listen, and if you believe that a schoolmaster can make a quicker wit than the Lord, you shall be made to see how much you're mistaken. Do you not hear something move in the brake? It has been crackling the twigs these 5 minutes. Now tell me what the creature is." "I hope nothing ferocious," exclaimed the doctor, who still retained a lively impression of his re-encounter with the Vespertilio horribilis. "You have rifles, friends? Would it not be pertinent to prime them? For this fowling piece of mine is little to be depended on." "There may be reason in what he says," returned the trapper, so far complying as to take his piece from the place where it had been lain during the repast, and raising its muzzle in the air. "Now tell me the name of the creature." "It exceeds the limits of earthly knowledge. Buffon himself could not tell whether the animal was a quadruped, or is of the order serpens, a sheep, or a tiger." "Then was your buffoon a fool to my Hector? Here, pup, what is it, dog? Shall we run it down, pup, or shall we let it pass?" The hound, which had already manifested to the experienced trapper, by the tremulous motion of his ears, his consciousness of the proximity of a strange animal, lifted his head from his forepaws and slightly parted his lips, as if about to show the remnants of his teeth. But, suddenly abandoning his hostile purpose, he snuffed the air a moment, gaped heavily, shook himself, and peaceably resumed his recumbent attitude. "Now, doctor," cried the trapper triumphantly, "I am well convinced there is neither game nor ravenous beast in the thicket, and that I call substantial knowledge to a man who is too old to be a spendthrift of his strength, and yet who would not wish to be a meal for a panther." The dog interrupted his master by a growl, but still kept his head crouched to the earth. "It is a man!" exclaimed the trapper, rising. "It is a man, if I am a judge of the creature's ways. There is but little said atwixt the hound and me, but we seldom mistake each other's meaning."
Paul Hover sprang to his feet like lightning, and throwing forward his rifle, he cried in a voice of menace— "Come forward, if a friend! If an enemy, stand ready for the worst!" "A friend, a white man, and I hope a Christian," returned a voice from the thicket, which opened at the same instant, and at the next the speaker made his appearance. Chapter 9.